Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. For this one, you guys have sent in some really heavy stuff, stories about wrongful convictions. And it's not easy to face this kind of stuff, but it is so important.
It really is.
We all rely on our justice system to protect innocent people. So when it goes wrong, it's like, well, it's a paradox.
It is a paradox. It's like the system that's meant to protect us ends up betraying us. And the material you've all sent in is just heartbreaking. True stories that really expose those failures. Our mission this time, to get to the core of it all, not just the fact that these injustices happen,
Right.
but why they happen, the real human cost, and what's being done to fight back. We got to look beyond the headlines here to see the deeper problems.
Absolutely. And that's the big question, isn't it? How can a system designed for justice, how can it cause such deep injustice? So in this deep dive, that's what we're going to explore. What leads to these failures? What's the real cost to people who are wrongly accused, their families? And the big one, what's being done and what more needs to be done to make things right? So, okay, let's get into it. The first thing that struck me going through this material is that wrongful convictions, they aren't just these rare freak occurrences. They're not.
Yeah, they're much more common than most people realize, and the sources you sent, they really hammer home the devastating consequences. Lives shattered, families torn apart, and this erosion of trust in the very idea of justice and fairness.
Yeah.
The bedrock of our society.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. And the material really gets into some of the root causes of these failures. One that stood out to me, and it's kind of surprising, is how unreliable eyewitness identification can be. I mean, you would think seeing something with your own eyes.
Yeah, you'd think it'd be the most solid evidence, right?
Right.
What's fascinating and concerning, of course, is how much faith we put in eyewitness accounts, even though research shows how flawed they can be. Our memories, they're not like perfect video recordings. We reconstruct them, and that makes them vulnerable, especially when someone is under stress. Like, imagine a scary situation. You might get tunnel vision, you focus on the threat like a weapon, and that makes it harder to remember the person holding it.
Oh, see.
Right. And then our minds try to fill in the gaps. Sometimes we get it wrong. It's called source monitoring error. And this means even a confident eyewitness can be completely mistaken.
So you're saying even if they're absolutely positive they saw something, it doesn't mean they're right.
Exactly. And when you think about the bigger picture, a wrong ID, even if it's sincere, it can throw off a whole investigation from the get-go. It affects how other evidence is seen, what steps the police take. It's a domino effect.
Wow, yeah. Make you think. Another thing that really stood out was the whole issue of false confessions. It's hard to wrap your head around why anyone would confess to a crime they didn't commit, right? I mean, it just seems...
It's counterintuitive, isn't it?
It's counterintuitive.
But it happens, and the sources really dig into the psychology of it and the intense pressure during interrogations. There are coercive tactics used sometimes, really long questioning that goes on, aggressive tactics, threats, even sleep deprivation. So you're in this super stressful situation, you reach a breaking point, and confessing feels like the only way out, even if you think you can take it back later.
So it's more about just ending that pressure.
Exactly. It's survival.
In that moment.
And the problem is, once that confession is on record, it's hard to get past it.
Yeah.
Juries tend to really latch on to confessions, even if there are inconsistencies or not much else to support it.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's hard to convince a jury it was coerced or untrue. A confession just creates this strong narrative, hard to dismantle, even with contradictory evidence.
It's hard to fight, yeah. And then there's the whole thing with forensics. I mean, we tend to think of that as purely objective science, like a guarantee. But the excerpts show that even that can be flawed.
That was eye-opening, right? The sources challenge this idea of forensic science always being right. They give examples where techniques have actually led to wrongful convictions, and then later, oops, they're proven unreliable. Things like hair analysis, bite mark comparisons, even some types of fingerprinting. What we thought was foolproof turns out it isn't. Science changes. And what was considered definitive evidence, well, maybe it wasn't. Like with hair and bite marks, it's a lot of subjective interpretation, pattern matching. It's not always as precise as you might think.
So what you're saying is one mistake, one wrong interpretation,
Yeah.
and someone could end up in prison for years.
Yeah, for something they didn't do. And thinking bigger picture, it shows how important it is to have really rigorous scientific standards. We need to constantly be checking and validating the methods used in court. And even when scientific evidence is presented, we need to maintain some healthy skepticism.
Yeah. And then there's a really tough topic. The sources bring up prosecutorial misconduct. Like the idea that people who are supposed to be upholding justice would do something to undermine it.
The drive to win cases, it can unfortunately lead to some really unethical, even illegal behavior. The sources highlight things like withholding evidence that could help the defendant, what's called exculpatory evidence, and the use of jailhouse informants, where inmates get deals for testifying even if they're not telling the truth.
It's hard to believe that happens.
It does, and it raises big questions about accountability in the justice system. We need strong safeguards to prevent this kind of misconduct and mechanisms to deal with it when it happens.
And then there's the whole issue of access to good legal representation. Not everyone can afford a top-notch lawyer.
Right. Absolutely, and the sources highlight this. People who can't afford experienced lawyers face huge challenges. Public defenders, they're often dedicated and overworked, but they may not have the time or resources to really dig into complex cases, challenge evidence effectively, or really grill witnesses. It puts defendants at a huge disadvantage.
So when you put all these factors together, eyewitness issues, false confessions, flawed forensics, prosecutorial misconduct, lack of good legal help for everyone, it paints a pretty troubling picture of the system, doesn't it? I mean, it's like...
Yeah, there are a lot of weak spots.
There are a lot.
And they can interact and make things worse. Like the sources say, it's not just about isolated mistakes. This points to systemic failures that make wrongful convictions more likely.
So this isn't just about bad luck or a few bad apples. This is
deeper than that.
Deeper than that. Okay. To understand the real human cost of this, the material you sent includes some really powerful case studies. One that really got to me was Richard Phillips' story.
Yeah, his case is a stark example of just how deeply injustice can run. He was wrongly convicted of murder in 1971. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. The conviction was based on one guy's testimony, and later, under oath, that guy admitted he lied to get a better deal.
And the material talks about how his lawyer wasn't able to really fight back, to point out the holes in the prosecution's case. It's awful.
And what makes it even more horrifying is how long he was wrongly imprisoned. 46 years. He was finally exonerated in 2018, but the damage is done. He lost his youth, his family. Imagine coming out into a world that's completely different after 46 years.
It's unimaginable. Like, how do you even begin to rebuild your life after that? I mean, the sources call his case one of the longest wrongful imprisonments in U.S. history. And it's a chilling reminder of how long injustice can persist.
And if you think back to the causes we talked about, they're all there in his case. The shaky eyewitness testimony, a witness who had a reason to lie, and a legal defense that wasn't strong enough.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
The material also talks about the psychological impact of being wrongly imprisoned. It goes so much deeper than just the loss of freedom.
It's trauma. The sources paint this bleak picture of prison life. The loss of control, the isolation, the constant fear. Imagine living with that, knowing you're innocent. It leads to lasting damage, depression, anxiety, PTSD. These are wounds you can't see, but they're there, haunting people even after they're released.
And there's also this loss of identity. You spend years in a system where every part of your life is controlled. It must be incredibly hard to find yourself again when you get out.
It is, and the sources talk about how hard it is for people to reintegrate into society, finding work, rebuilding relationships, just navigating a world that's moved on without them. And there's the stigma of having been in prison, even if you're exonerated. It can be so isolating.
The material mentions apprentice Brunchy Carter. His story really shows how devastating these psychological effects can be.
Yeah, his story is heartbreaking. It shows that even after you're freed, the trauma of wrongful imprisonment can be fatal. He took his own life. It underscores that being exonerated doesn't erase the years of suffering and the lasting impact on a person's mental and emotional well-being. It can be that severe.
It's a tragic reminder that justice delayed can be justice denied in the most profound way. But the sources also point to the resilience of some exonerees. They become advocates for change, even though, as the sources say, they can never get back those lost years.
It's amazing to see how they channel their pain into fighting for change. It speaks volumes about the injustice they faced and their determination to prevent it from happening to others.
One more story I wanted to discuss: Anthony Graves. His experience is especially chilling because he spent 18 years on death row, always maintaining his innocence.
Anthony Graves's case is a terrifying example of how close we came to executing an innocent man. 18 years under the threat of death, constantly saying he didn't do it. It shows how high the stakes are in this fight against wrongful convictions. The sources go into the details. A horrific multiple homicide in Texas, pressure to find the killer, and then Robert Carter, this guy who falsely implicates Graves as an accomplice.
And the sources are clear. There was absolutely no physical evidence tying Graves to the crime, no motive, no other witnesses, nothing, just Carter's word, which we know now was a lie.
Exactly. His conviction was solely based on false testimony, and the sources describe as years on death row, the fight his lawyers put up, and how they finally uncovered Carter's own admissions that he'd made everything up. But even with that, the system was slow to admit the error. It's disturbing.
All right, it's like they didn't want to believe they'd messed up so badly.
Right.
So what happened? I mean, what was the outcome?
After years of legal battles, his conviction was overturned in 2006. But get this, they tried to retry him. It wasn't until 2010 that he was fully exonerated, so 18 years, most of it on death row, for a crime he didn't commit. It's mind-boggling.
It's hard to comprehend. His story really shows the immense hurdles involved in overturning a wrongful conviction, even when the truth comes out. And then to think, he went on to become an advocate for criminal justice reform. Talk about resilience. Okay, so given these massive obstacles, how do wrongful convictions ever get overturned? The material talks about some of the ways.
Well, sources make it clear it's a fight. You're battling the very system that made the mistake in the first place. And DNA evidence, it's a powerful tool, especially for older cases. Organizations like the Innocence Project have used DNA to free countless people. It's amazing the work they do.
But what about cases where there's no DNA evidence? What then?
Yeah. The sources talk about the crucial role of investigative journalists, lawyers who work pro bono, and advocacy groups. They go through old case files, re-interview witnesses, look for inconsistencies. It's painstaking work, but it can uncover the truth. They also talk about the importance of witnesses changing their stories, coming forward with new information. But getting the courts to act on that new information, it's not always easy.
It's a long process. It takes time and persistence.
It does.
The sources also mention public awareness and political pressure. It seems like those can play a role in getting cases re-examined.
Yeah, when a case gets a lot of attention from the media or social media, it can put pressure on the system to take another look. And sometimes that's what it takes to get justice. But the sources also point out a sad reality. Many people who are wrongfully convicted, they die in prison, or they're released, but with no support to help them put their lives back together. They're free, but it's not over.
It's a long road. And sadly, as the sources highlight, it can be a road that ends in tragedy, even after exoneration, like in the case of Larry Griffin.
Yeah, his story is a powerful reminder that we can't undo the ultimate injustice. He was wrongfully convicted and executed. The sources go into the details. A 1980 drive-by shooting, the quick focus on Griffin, even though he had no real connection to the victim. His conviction relied on one witness, Robert Fitzgerald, and we find out later this Fitzgerald guy was a paid police informant. And not only that, he had a history of being unreliable. But this was all kept from the defense during the trial.
So they basically used a known liar to get a conviction.
And there was no other evidence. No murder weapon, no motive, nothing. Griffin maintained his innocence for 15 years on death row, but his appeals were denied. And in 1995, he was executed.
And the worst part is, the truth came out afterward, right?
Right. There was an investigation after the execution, and what did they find? That Fitzgerald was a paid informant, that there were new witnesses who put Griffin somewhere else at the time of the shooting, and even the first responders, the ones who saw the victim alive, they were never interviewed. It points to a really flawed investigation. Griffin was most likely innocent, but it was too late.
And that's the thing with the death penalty. There's no going back. So it's not just about getting justice for the wrongly convicted. It's about preventing this from happening in the first place. What are some of the solutions the sources suggest for reforming the system?
They talk about a lot of things. Starting with forensic science, they say we need to move away from these unreliable methods and focus on scientifically validated techniques. They talk about reforming how eyewitness testimony is handled, using things like double-blind lineups to reduce error.
I've heard of those. So basically, the person showing the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is either. It's supposed to prevent any bias.
Exactly. And they talk about addressing the problem of false confessions, making sure interrogations are recorded, and educating judges about the psychology behind why innocent people confess. And then there's the issue of prosecutorial misconduct. They say we need independent review boards to investigate these cases and impose penalties when prosecutors cross the line.
So more accountability, basically.
Right, more accountability. They also argue for wider access to post-conviction DNA testing. It shouldn't be so hard for someone to get their case re-examined if there's potential DNA evidence that could prove their innocence. And, of course, there's the debate about the death penalty. Given the risk of executing an innocent person, they suggest either reforming it or getting rid of it altogether.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. But the main takeaway I'm getting is that change requires a real commitment to the truth, even when it means admitting that the system got it wrong.
Yeah, it's about making sure justice is served, not just getting convictions.
Right. It's not about winning or losing. It's about finding the truth. The stories you shared, they really highlight how wrongful convictions affect so much more than just the individuals involved. They impact their families, their communities, and they shake our faith in the whole idea of justice.
Exactly. Every wrongful conviction chips away at that trust. It shows us how vulnerable the system is, how things can go wrong. And the sources make a really important point. Fixing this requires constant vigilance. It takes lawyers, journalists, activists, and everyday people staying informed and engaged. We all have a role to play.
So it's not just about fixing the laws. It's about changing the culture.
Absolutely. It's about making sure justice is a priority for everyone.
And that leaves us with some really big questions, doesn't it? How many more people are out there wrongly convicted, waiting for their cases to be heard? What's the true cost of these injustices? And how can we make sure our system values the truth above all else?
These are questions we all need to grapple with. The sources encourage us to learn more, to support reform efforts, and to keep these conversations going. Awareness is key. The more people know about this issue, the more we can push for change.
It's about making sure everyone understands that justice isn't just a word, it's a responsibility. Well, that was a lot to take in. It's heavy stuff, but so important. Thanks for diving into this with me.
Absolutely.
To everyone listening, thank you for sending in this material. Keep those stories coming, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a more just world. Until next time, stay curious and keep digging.